Stop defending yourself and watch what happens to your entire life. Right now, in this moment, you're giving away your power. Every time you justify yourself to someone who doesn't deserve an explanation. Every time you explain your choices to people who've already decided what they think about you. Every time you defend your existence to someone who will never understand you anyway. You're bleeding energy into a black hole that will never be satisfied. Carl Jung is going to show you exactly why you do this, why it's destroying you, and how to stop it forever. Because when you finally stop defending yourself, nothing and nobody will ever control you again. There was a man named David who spent 20 years explaining himself to everyone. At work, when his boss questioned his methods, David would launch into detailed justifications. He'd pull up spreadsheets, reference past successes, explain his reasoning step by step. He thought he was being thorough, professional, but his hands would shake while he did it. His voice would get higher. His colleagues could see the desperation in his eyes, even when his words sounded confident. At home, when his wife made a passive-aggressive comment about how he spent his weekend, David would defend every decision. "I needed that time because of the project deadline, and you know how stressed I've been, and I told you about this last week, remember?" He'd build a case like he was in court. He'd present evidence. He'd cross-reference previous conversations. He'd try to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that he wasn't the bad guy. With his parents, it was worse. At 38 years old, David was still explaining why he chose his career, why he lived where he lived, why he married who he married, why he made the choices he made. His mother would sigh, that specific sigh that said everything, and David would feel himself shrinking, becoming smaller, becoming that 7-year-old boy again who desperately needed to prove he was good enough. One Tuesday afternoon, David sat in a meeting with his boss and 3 colleagues. They were reviewing the quarterly strategy, and David had spent weeks preparing his proposal. He believed in it. He'd done the research. He'd run the numbers. His boss glanced at the first page and dismissed it with a casual wave. "That won't work, David. You're overthinking it. We need something simpler." And David felt it rise up in his chest, that familiar panic, that need to explain, to justify, to defend. His heart started racing. His palms got sweaty. The words were already forming in his mind, organizing themselves into arguments, into evidence, into proof. He opened his mouth. "But if you look at the data from last quarter," his boss cut him off. "David, I don't need a dissertation. The answer is no." David's face flushed. He could feel his colleagues' eyes on him. He wanted to keep going, to make them understand, to prove that he wasn't stupid, wasn't wrong, wasn't wasting everyone's time. But something stopped him. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was the recognition of a pattern he'd repeated 10,000 times before. Maybe it was the sudden, crushing awareness that no amount of evidence would change his boss's mind, because his boss had already decided. David closed his mouth. He said nothing. He just nodded and let the moment pass. And in that silence, something shifted. His boss moved on to the next topic. The meeting continued. The world didn't end. Nobody thought less of him. In fact, nobody seemed to notice at all except David himself, but David noticed everything. For the first time in 20 years, David realized something that changed everything. He had been giving his power away to anyone who questioned him. Every defense was an admission that they had the right to judge him. Every justification was a transfer of authority from his hands to theirs. Every explanation was him saying, "You're the one who decides if I'm acceptable or not." He had been living his entire life in a courtroom where everyone else was the judge, and he was perpetually on trial. And he was so tired, so profoundly, bone-deep exhausted from carrying the burden of proof everywhere he went. That night, David couldn't sleep. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, and a question kept circling his mind like a vulture. What would happen if I just stopped? What would happen if he stopped defending himself? Stopped explaining, stopped trying to prove his worth to people who had already decided what they thought? Stopped performing for an audience that would never be satisfied? He didn't know, but he knew he couldn't keep living the way he had been. Something had to change, and that something was him. This is where Carl Jung enters the picture. And this is where everything David thought he understood about himself gets turned upside down. Jung understood something profound about human psychology that most people never grasp in their entire lives. We create a persona, a mask, that we show to the world. And the more we defend that persona, the more we betray our authentic self. But it's not just a simple mask. It's more complex than that. Think of it like this. Imagine you're an actor on a stage. The persona is the character you're playing. And over time, you've gotten so good at playing this character, so practiced at the lines, the movements, the expressions, that you've forgotten there's a real person underneath the costume. When someone criticizes your performance, when someone says they don't like your character, you panic. Because you've invested everything in this performance. You've poured your energy into making this character believable, likable, acceptable. So you defend the character. You explain the character's motivations. You justify the character's choices. You try to make the audience understand why the character deserves their approval. But here's what Jung realized, and here's what will change your life when you truly understand it. The character isn't you. The persona isn't you. And the more energy you pour into defending the reflection in the mirror, the less connected you become to the actual substance behind it. When you defend yourself, you're operating from the persona. You're trying to control what other people see, what they think, what they believe about the mask you're wearing. And in doing so, you give them complete power over you. Because if their opinion can make you scramble to justify yourself, then their opinion controls your peace. If their judgment can make you lose sleep, then their judgment determines your worth. If their approval becomes necessary for you to feel okay about yourself, then their approval becomes the oxygen your life needs to survive. Jung called this living from the outside in. You let the external world dictate your internal state. You give strangers and critics and people who don't even know you the authority to determine whether you're acceptable or not. And here's the cruelest part. The part that will make you angry when you realize how much of your life you've wasted. It never ends. No amount of defending satisfies the critic. No amount of justifying changes the judgment. No amount of explaining earns the understanding. Because the people who require you to constantly defend yourself aren't actually interested in understanding you. They're interested in maintaining power over you. You defend yourself because somewhere along the line, maybe in childhood when your parents' love felt conditional, maybe in school when acceptance required you to be someone you weren't, maybe in a relationship where you learned that being yourself wasn't enough, maybe in 1,000 small moments you can't even remember, you learned that you weren't acceptable as you were. You learned that love was conditional, that belonging required justification, that your existence needed a defense. So you built a case. You gathered evidence. You prepared your arguments for why you deserve to take up space in the world. And you've been delivering those arguments ever since. In every meeting, in every relationship, in every social interaction where someone questions your choices. David realized this one evening when he was journaling, trying to understand his pattern. He remembered being 8 years old, showing his mother a drawing he'd made at school. She'd glanced at it and said, "Why did you use so much red? Don't you think blue would have been prettier?" And 8-year-old David had immediately started explaining, defending his choice of red, justifying his artistic vision as if he were on trial for the crime of creative expression. He'd been doing it ever since, for 30 years. But here's the truth that Jung understood, and that David was beginning to learn. The people who require you to defend yourself are the people who have already decided you're guilty. Your defense doesn't change their verdict. It just exhausts you. And more than that, your defense validates their right to judge you in the first place. It says, yes, you have authority over my choices. Yes, your approval matters. Yes, I need to prove myself to you. Jung understood that authentic individuation, becoming your true self, requires you to stop performing for the jury. Stop explaining yourself to people who aren't listening. Stop bleeding your energy into the void of other people's opinions. The question isn't whether you have good reasons for your choices. Of course you do. The question is, why do you need to prove those reasons to people who have no actual authority over your life? And when David realized this, when he truly understood that his constant defending was a form of self-betrayal, a rejection of his own authority in favor of external validation, everything began to change. Let me show you exactly how this plays out in real life. Because theory is useless unless you can see how it applies to the actual moments when you're standing there, heart racing, feeling that overwhelming need to explain yourself. 2 weeks after that meeting, David's boss called him into his office. He'd been reviewing the report David submitted, a comprehensive analysis of market trends and strategic recommendations. His boss dropped the report on the desk between them. "This isn't what I asked for, David. You're missing the point entirely. I needed something actionable, and you gave me academic theory." Old David, the David from 3 weeks ago, would have erupted into immediate defense mode. His body would have tensed, his voice would have gotten defensive and high-pitched, and he would have launched into justification. Actually, if you look at page 3, I addressed exactly what you mentioned in the brief, and based on the data from Q3, this approach makes more sense because the market indicators show he would have scrambled, pulled out evidence, built his case point by point, tried to prove that he hadn't failed, hadn't misunderstood, hadn't wasted the company's time and his boss's patience. But David had been thinking about Jung, about persona versus authentic self, about the transfer of power that happens every single time you defend yourself to someone who's already made up their mind. So instead, David took a breath and said, "Okay." Just that. Okay. No explanation, no justification, no defense. His boss blinked, waited for more. There was no more. The silence stretched between them. David could see his boss getting uncomfortable. This wasn't how their dynamic usually worked. Usually, David would scramble, and his boss would have the satisfaction of watching him scramble. Usually, David's defense would give his boss more things to criticize, more ways to assert his authority. "Well," his boss said, looking genuinely off balance now, "maybe you could revise it based on what I actually need." "I can do that," David said. Still no emotion, no defense, no justification, just a simple acknowledgement of the request. "By Friday," his boss added, trying to reassert control. "I'll see what I can do," David said, not agreeing, not refusing, just acknowledging. The conversation ended. David walked out of the office, and for the first time in his career, he didn't feel like he'd been punched in the stomach. He felt calm, clear, in control. Here's what actually happens when you stop defending yourself in the workplace. People don't know what to do with you. The power dynamic they're used to suddenly doesn't work anymore. They're used to your defense giving them something to push against. They're used to your justifications giving them more ammunition to criticize. They're used to your scrambling giving them the confirmation that they're the authority and you're the subordinate who needs their approval. When you remove the defense, you remove their leverage. You refuse to play the game, and the game can't continue with only one player. David revised the report. He did it on his terms, in his timeline, without the emotional hemorrhaging that usually accompanied his boss's criticism. He made changes he agreed with and left in elements he believed were important. And something interesting happened when he submitted the revised version. His boss accepted it without comment. No praise, but also no additional criticism. And over the following weeks, David noticed his boss started questioning him less, started trusting his judgment more, started treating him less like a subordinate who needed constant correction and more like a competent professional, because criticism is only satisfying when it gets a reaction. When it lands in silence, when it hits someone who isn't defending themselves, it loses its power. And people unconsciously stop doing things that don't give them the payoff they're seeking. But the real test, The test that would determine whether David had actually learned anything or was just trying out a new technique at work came at home. David had planned a weekend trip with his college friends, 3 days hiking in the mountains. He'd told his wife, Sarah, about it 6 weeks in advance. She'd said it was fine. They'd talked about it multiple times. She'd even helped him pack. But when David came home Sunday evening, tired and happy and ready to reconnect with his wife, he walked into an atmosphere so cold he could have seen his breath. Sarah was on the couch, scrolling through her phone with that particular energy that said everything without saying anything. David knew this energy. He'd been dealing with it for 8 years of marriage. "Hey," he said, dropping his bag by the door, "I missed you." Sarah didn't look up. "Must be nice," she said, her voice flat and sharp at the same time, "to just disappear whenever you want." Some of us don't have that luxury, and there it was. The trap, the invitation to defend himself, the opening to a fight that David could already see unfolding in perfect detail because they'd had this fight 100 times before in various forms. Old David would have erupted. "We talked about this." "You said it was fine. I haven't seen these friends in 8 months, and you went to visit your sister for 4 days last month, remember? I'm allowed to have a life. I'm allowed to have friends. Why do you do this every time The defense would have triggered a counterattack. Sarah would have brought up 3 other things he'd done wrong in the past month. He would have defended those too. She would have escalated. He would have gotten louder. Both of them would have said things they didn't mean. Both of them would have gone to bed angry, feeling misunderstood, building resentment like layers of sediment that would eventually bury their marriage. David had played this game so many times he could recite both parts, and he was exhausted by it. But David was learning something profound about the nature of defensiveness, something Jung had understood about human psychology. When someone makes an accusation that isn't based in reality, your defense validates the accusation. It treats the false premise as if it deserves a response. It gives power to a narrative that has no basis in fact. So David did something revolutionary, something that felt terrifying in the moment but would change everything about his marriage. He sat down next to Sarah on the couch. He didn't touch her. He could feel she didn't want to be touched, but he sat close enough that she couldn't ignore him. And he said, "I hear that you're upset." That's it. No defense, no justification, no counter-accusations about how she'd said it was fine, how she'd gone away last month, how this was unfair. Sarah looked at him like he'd started speaking a foreign language. She'd loaded the gun, pulled the trigger, aimed directly at his chest, and the bullet had hit nothing but air. She didn't know what to do with that. Sarah started, then stopped. Her face did something complex, anger and confusion and something underneath that looked like vulnerability. Without David's defense to push against, she had to actually examine what she was feeling instead of just reacting to his reaction. "I just missed you," she finally said, her voice smaller now. "And I felt lonely. And then I felt stupid for feeling lonely because I told you to go. And I meant it when I said it, but then you were gone and I was here and I missed you." There it was. The truth beneath the accusation. The real feeling under the attack. David could have defended himself. Could have proven, point by point, that he'd done nothing wrong. Could have won the argument. Could have made her admit that her attack was unjustified, but he would have lost his wife's heart in the process. Instead, he said, "I missed you too. The whole time I was gone, I kept thinking about things I wanted to tell you. I'm here now. I'm right here." Sarah started crying, not angry crying, relieved crying, because for the first time in their marriage, David had been secure enough in himself to not defend against her pain, to not make her feelings about him and whether he was right or wrong, to just let her feel what she felt without needing to protect himself from it. Here's what Jung understood that most people miss. When someone attacks you, they're usually not actually attacking you at all. They're expressing their own pain, their own fear, their own insecurity, their own unmet need. And when you defend yourself against that attack, when you make it about whether you're right or wrong, you're actually rejecting their pain. You're saying, your feelings don't matter. What matters is whether I can prove I didn't do anything wrong. But when you stop defending, when you let their words land without immediately building a case against them, you create space for the actual truth to emerge. The truth underneath the attack. Sarah didn't need David to prove he had the right to see his friends. She didn't need a logical argument about fairness or a list of all the times she'd gone away. She needed him to acknowledge that she felt lonely. She needed him to be present with her pain without making it mean something about his worth or his rights or his freedom. And his refusal to defend himself, his security in his own choices, was the first time in their 8-year marriage that he'd been solid enough to hold space for her feelings without collapsing into defense mode. But if the test with Sarah was hard, the test with his mother was almost impossible. David's mother had perfected, over decades of practice, the art of the cutting observation disguised as maternal concern. She could deliver a devastating critique while smiling sweetly and framing it as worry. She was a master. 3 weeks after the weekend trip, David and Sarah went to his parents' house for Sunday dinner. Everything was fine until dessert, when his mother looked at him with that expression he knew too well. "You look tired, David. You look worn out. Is that job of yours too much for you? I always thought you should have gone into teaching like I suggested. Teachers have summers off. You'd have more time to rest, more time for family. But you always insisted on going your own way. And now, look at you." 20 years of defending himself against variations of this statement. 20 years of explaining his career choices, justifying his path, trying to prove that he hadn't made a mistake, that he wasn't failing, that he wasn't a disappointment to the woman who gave birth to him. And David felt the familiar response rising like bile. All the evidence lined up and ready to present. The salary he earned that was 3 times what teachers make. The promotions he'd received, the respect he'd built in his field, the projects he'd led, the people he'd mentored. All the proof that he wasn't failing, wasn't making a mistake, wasn't wasting his potential. The need to defend himself was almost overwhelming, because this wasn't just his boss or a friend. This was his mother. And somewhere deep in his nervous system, in the places that get wired in childhood, David still believed he needed her approval to be okay. But then he remembered something Jung wrote. "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. Not who your parents think you should be. Not who society expects you to be. Not who you think you need to be to earn love. Who you truly are." And David realized his mother's approval was not the measure of his worth. Her understanding was not required for his choices to be valid. Her acceptance was not the oxygen his life needed to survive. So David smiled, a genuine smile, not a defensive one, and said, "I like my job, Mom. It challenges me." His mother waited for more. More explanation, more defense, more justification, more of the dance they'd been doing for 38 years, where she pushed and he justified, and she pushed harder, and he defended more desperately. It didn't come. "Well," she said, visibly flustered by his refusal to engage, "I just worry about you." "I'm your mother. I'm allowed to worry." "I know you do," David said. Not defensive, not angry, not even trying to convince her not to worry, just acknowledging her feelings without making them his responsibility to fix. The conversation moved on, but his mother couldn't let it go. She brought it up twice more during dinner. These little probes, these small tests to see if she could get him to engage, to defend, to justify himself the way he always had. Each time, David responded with simple acknowledgement and redirected. "I appreciate your concern, Mom." And then he'd ask her about her garden or his father's golf game or anything else that moved the conversation forward. Here's what happens when you stop defending yourself to your parents. You finally grow up. Not in age, you might be 40 or 50 or 60. But you grow up in psychological authority. You stop being the child seeking approval and become the adult who knows their own worth. Your parents might not like it at first. They're used to your defensiveness. It's familiar. It maintains the power dynamic where they're the authority and you're the supplicant. where they offer judgment and you offer justification. But when you stop playing that game, you free yourself from a prison you didn't even know you were in. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, you free them too. You free them from the exhausting role of being the eternal judge. You invite them into an adult relationship where both parties are equals. David's mother didn't magically change that night. She still had her opinions, her concerns, her suggestions for how he should live his life differently. But David noticed something shifting in their relationship over the following months. She started asking about his work with genuine curiosity instead of veiled criticism. She started respecting his choices even when she didn't understand them. Because when you stop defending yourself, you stop inviting people to attack you. And when the attack doesn't work anymore, people either adjust their behavior or they remove themselves from your life. Either way, you win. David had a friend named Mark, whom he'd known since college. They'd been close once, but over the years, their friendship had developed an edge that David was only now beginning to recognize as toxic. Mark specialized in subtle put-downs disguised as jokes. He had a gift for making you feel small while laughing as if it were all in good fun. They were at a group dinner when Mark looked at David's car keys on the table. "Man, are you still driving that 07 Civic? Dude, when are you going to upgrade? What are you, saving for retirement at 40, living that minimalist life, or just broke?" Everyone laughed. It was said lightly, playfully. But there was an edge underneath. There was always an edge with Mark. Old David would have jumped to defend himself. "Actually, the car runs great, and I'm investing my money in..." And he'd be off, explaining his financial strategy, his investment portfolio, his retirement planning, trying to prove to a table full of people who didn't actually care that he wasn't broke, wasn't failing, wasn't the loser Mark's comment implied he might be. But David was done giving reactions to people who didn't deserve them. So, when Mark made his next comment, something about David's shoes being vintage with that particular inflection that meant cheap and outdated, David just laughed and said, "Yeah, they are," and moved on, redirected to someone else, asked a question, shifted the focus. No defense, no justification, no engagement with the underlying put-down. Mark tried twice more that evening. The comments got a little sharper, a little more direct, because he wasn't getting the reaction he wanted. But each time, David responded with brief acknowledgement and redirected the conversation. And by the end of the night, Mark had stopped. Because put-downs are only satisfying when they land, when they provoke a defensive response, when they make the other person scramble to prove they're not what the put-down implies. When they hit air, when they hit someone who's secure enough in themselves that they don't need to defend against subtle attacks, they're just awkward. They make the person delivering them look petty and insecure. Here's what Jung knew and what David was learning through these painful, transformative experiences. Your silence is more powerful than your defense. Your refusal to engage with false accusations or subtle attacks is a demonstration of sovereignty that no amount of justification could ever achieve. Because when you defend yourself, you're saying, "Your opinion of me matters enough to make me uncomfortable. Your judgment holds weight in my life. I need you to think well of me. I need you to understand that I'm not what you're implying I am." But when you stop defending, you're saying something completely different. You're saying, "Your opinion is just that, an opinion. It doesn't define me. It doesn't determine my worth. I don't need you to understand me, or approve of me, or think well of me. I know who I am, and your assessment of me, whether positive or negative, doesn't change that." And that is freedom. That is the psychological sovereignty Jung talked about. That is what it means to live from the inside out instead of the outside in. Within 3 months, David noticed something remarkable. Mark had stopped making those comments entirely. Not because David had defended himself and won the argument. Not because David had proven Mark wrong, but because David's consistent lack of defense had removed the payoff Mark was seeking. Mark's behavior had been about getting a reaction. about maintaining a power dynamic where he was the one delivering judgments and David was the one scrambling to disprove them. When the reaction disappeared, when David stopped playing his assigned role in that dynamic, the behavior lost its function. And Mark either had to develop a genuine friendship with David based on mutual respect, or he had to fade away. As it turned out, Mark chose to change. Without the put-down dynamic to fall back on, Mark started relating to David as an equal. And underneath all that defensive posturing, there was actually a decent person who was capable of real friendship. But even if Mark had chosen to fade away, David would have been fine with that. Because he'd learned something profound. It's better to be alone than to give your power away to people who use it to diminish you. So, how do you actually do this? How do you stop defending yourself when every instinct in your body, every pattern wired in childhood, every nervous system response trained over decades is screaming at you to explain, justify, prove your worth? Jung would tell you it's a process of individuation, of psychologically separating from the collective opinion and becoming who you truly are. But let me make it practical. Let me give you the actual steps David took, the steps you can take starting today. First, recognize the pattern before it has you. This is crucial. You have to catch the defense mechanism before it fully activates. The next time someone criticizes you, questions you, makes a passive-aggressive comment, makes a joke at your expense, notice what happens in your body, and I mean really notice with precise attention. The tightening in your chest, the heat rising in your face, the way your hands might clench, the way your breath gets shallow. The way your mind starts racing, organizing arguments, gathering evidence, preparing your case. That's your defense mechanism activating. And you have about 3 seconds, maybe less, before it takes over completely and you're back in the old pattern. In those 3 seconds, before you open your mouth, ask yourself one question. Is this person genuinely trying to understand me, or are they looking for a reaction? If they're genuinely trying to understand, if there's real curiosity or concern in their question, then a simple, calm explanation might be appropriate. But if they're fishing for a response, testing your boundaries, projecting their own insecurity onto you, or trying to maintain power over you through criticism, your defense will only feed that dynamic. Second, develop your anchor statement. You need a go-to response that acknowledges without defending, that recognizes without justifying, that allows the other person's words to exist without making them your emergency. David's anchor statement was, "I hear you." Sometimes it was okay. Sometimes it was just a thoughtful nod. Sometimes it was, "Thanks for sharing that." The specific words matter less than the energy behind them. Find the phrase that works for you. Practice it. Say it out loud when you're alone so it feels natural in your mouth. Because in the moment when someone's attacking you and your nervous system is screaming, you won't be able to think clearly. You need this anchor statement to be automatic. This isn't dismissive, it's not aggressive, it's not passive-aggressive. It's simply refusing to engage with the invitation to defend yourself. It's maintaining your psychological sovereignty while acknowledging that the other person has feelings and opinions. Third, separate your identity from your persona. This is Jung's core teaching, and it's the most important thing you need to understand. Your persona. The mask you show the world, the role you play at work or in your family or in social situations is not who you are. It's just the interface between your authentic self and society. It's the character you play on the stage. When someone criticizes your persona, they're not actually criticizing you. They're not reaching through to your essence and finding it lacking. They're responding to the mask, the role, the character. And the mask doesn't need defending because it's not real anyway. Your authentic self, your actual essence, the you, underneath all the roles and masks and performances, is beyond criticism. It simply is. It exists. It has inherent worth that doesn't depend on anyone else's assessment. When you know this, when you truly, deeply know this, the need to defend evaporates. Because you understand that criticism of your persona is just feedback about the character you're playing, not a verdict on your essential worth. Fourth, understand the power dynamics at play. Every defense is a transfer of power. Every justification is you handing your authority to someone else. When you defend yourself, you're essentially saying, "You have the authority to judge me. Your assessment matters. I need to convince you that I'm acceptable." But when you stop defending, you're reclaiming that authority. You're saying, "My worth is not up for debate. My choices are mine to make and mine to live with. Your approval, while perhaps nice to have, is not required for me to feel okay about myself." This doesn't mean being rude or dismissive or disrespectful. It doesn't mean you don't value other people's perspectives or input. It means you're secure enough in yourself that you don't collapse into defense mode every time someone disagrees with you or questions you or expresses an opinion about your choices. It means you can listen to criticism without internalizing it as a verdict on your worth. You can consider other perspectives without abandoning your own judgment. You can remain open without being defensive. Fifth, give it time to rewire. David found that the first month was the hardest. Every single time he chose not to defend himself, his nervous system screamed that he was making a terrible mistake, that his silence would be interpreted as guilt or weakness or agreement, that he needed to explain, needed to justify, needed to make people understand. His body would have the same stress response as if he were in physical danger. His heart would race, his palms would sweat. He'd lie awake at night replaying conversations and wishing he'd said more, defended better, proven his case more thoroughly. But he didn't give in to those feelings. He let them exist without acting on them. And gradually, slowly, over weeks and then months, his nervous system began to learn that he could survive without defending himself. That he could be okay even when people misunderstood him or judged him or disapproved of his choices. The defensive response got quieter. The need to explain got less urgent. The peace that came from not engaging in those battles became its own reward. 6 months after that first moment in the meeting when David closed his mouth and chose not to defend himself, he barely recognized his life. At work, his boss had stopped questioning every decision. Not because David had proven himself through repeated justifications, but because David had established a new boundary. He would not be drawn into defending his competence. Their dynamic had shifted from superior-subordinate to mutual respect between professionals. At home, Sarah had stopped making passive-aggressive comments. When she was hurt or upset, she said so directly. When she needed something, she asked. Their communication had become honest instead of coded. Their fights, when they had them, were about actual issues instead of about David's right to make his own choices. With his parents, the dynamic had fundamentally changed. They still had their opinions. They still offered suggestions. They still worried. But David no longer internalized their concerns as verdicts on his worth. He could listen without defending. He could acknowledge without agreeing. He could love them without needing their approval. And with friends like Mark, well, Mark had actually become a better friend. When the put-down dynamic stopped working, when David refused to engage with it, Mark had to find a new way to relate. And underneath the defensive posturing, there was a person capable of genuine connection. But the biggest change, the change that mattered most, was internal. David no longer carried that constant tension in his chest, that vigilance, that waiting for the next attack readiness. That feeling of always being on trial, always needing to have his defense prepared, always needing to justify his existence. He had stepped out of the courtroom. He had fired the jury. He had reclaimed the authority over his own life. And in doing so, he had finally become free. Remember that Tuesday afternoon in the meeting when David first stopped defending himself? That moment when he closed his mouth and let the silence speak? That was the moment everything changed. Not because the external world suddenly recognized his worth. Not because people started treating him better immediately. Not because he won some argument or proved some point. Everything changed because he stopped seeking external validation for his internal worth. Here's what Jung understood, what David learned, and what you need to know with absolute clarity. Your life transforms the moment you stop giving your power away to anyone who questions you. When you stop defending yourself, you're not being passive. You're not giving up. You're not admitting defeat. You're not agreeing with their assessment or accepting their judgment. You're doing something far more powerful. You're reclaiming sovereignty over your own existence. You're saying, I am not on trial. My choices don't require your approval to be valid. My worth is not determined by your understanding. My life is mine to live, and I don't owe anyone an explanation for how I choose to live it. You've been bleeding energy into a black hole your entire life. Every defense, every justification, every desperate attempt to prove yourself to people who will never be satisfied because their criticism isn't actually about you. It's about their own insecurity, their own fear, their own need to feel superior by making others feel small. And what has all that defending gotten you? Exhaustion, resentment, anxiety. A life lived in constant reaction to other people's opinions instead of in conscious response to your own values. But when you stop defending yourself, when you truly, completely, courageously stop, watch what happens. People's power over you evaporates. Their criticisms land in silence and disappear like stones in deep water. Their attempts to control you through judgment fail because you're no longer giving them the reaction they need. Their opinions become just that, opinions, instead of verdicts that you internalize as truth. And in that silence, in that spaciousness where your defense used to be, your authentic self emerges, the self that doesn't need approval because it knows its own worth. The self that doesn't require understanding because it understands itself, the self that lives from the inside out, not the outside in. Jung called this individuation. The process of becoming who you actually are, separate from what everyone else thinks you should be. The journey of separating from the collective opinion and standing in your own truth. But it requires you to do the hardest thing a human can do. Stop defending the mask and allow your true face to be seen. Stop protecting the persona and risk showing up as your authentic self. Most people will never do this. They'll spend their entire lives in the courtroom, presenting evidence, building cases, trying desperately to prove their worth to judges who have no real authority. They'll exhaust themselves in defense of a persona that was never real in the first place. They'll die having never known the freedom of living as their authentic selves. But you're different. You're here because some part of you knows there's another way. Some part of you is exhausted by the constant defending, the endless justifying, the perpetual explaining yourself to people who will never understand because they're not trying to understand. They're trying to control. So stop. Stop defending yourself and watch what happens to your entire life. Watch how people start treating you with more respect when you stop seeking their approval. Watch how relationships become more honest when you stop being defensive. Watch how your own peace returns when you stop internalizing everyone else's opinions as truth. Watch how your authentic self emerges when you stop protecting the mask. Watch how your energy returns when you're no longer bleeding it into the void of other people's judgments. Watch how your confidence grows when it's rooted in internal knowing rather than external validation. Watch how your life becomes yours again when you stop living in reaction to everyone else's expectations. And when you finally, truly stop defending yourself, when you step out of the courtroom and reclaim the authority over your own life, nothing and nobody will ever control you again. Not their criticism, not their judgment, not their misunderstanding, not their disapproval, not their opinions about who you should be or what you should do or how you should live. You will be free. And that freedom, that sovereign, unshakable, internal freedom, that is everything.